Hello and welcome to another anime lore and theory video. I'm Shergok, your host, and today we are going to take a closer look at the army of Yaldabaoth, the Demon Emperor, and where it even originates from. But before we're going to take a closer look at any of this, let me quickly thank my Patreons for supporting this channel, and say my thanks to all users of the YouTube thanks function for making one-time donations. And with that said, let's take a look at the topic at hand. In the trailer for the latest Overlord movie, set in the Holy Kingdom, and adapting volumes 12 and 13, we not only see Demiurge in his role as the Demon Emperor Yaldabaoth, who after being driven off from Rhea's ties by Momon the Adventurer, now stands before a wall at the border of the Holy Kingdom, but also the army that stands behind him. And that is precisely what we will focus on today. Where did Demiurge get his army from, and from which troops it was even created, and what additional forces can be drawn upon for reinforcement. But unlike in my last video about Yaldabaoth and what he's actually doing, this video will contain spoilers, simply because the trailer doesn't provide much more information I can talk about, other than the army is there and stands behind him. And with that said, we are already at the first point I want to make. While Demiurge summoned the last troops he led into battle through his evil lords, here Demiurge has not assembled a demonic military force, but rather a force consisting of heteromorphs and demi-humans. These beings come from the Hills of Abalion. The territory begins near the wall of the Holy Kingdom and ends somewhere near the Theocracy of Slain. But again, the exact extent and location of the region is thus far unknown, and the political situation within the hills is complex, and the land is fractured, to put it mildly. The hills are divided between hundreds of different tribes of demi-humans and heteromorphs, spider creatures, insect warriors, ape-like beastmen, lamias, which are snake-like humans, goat people, and many other. But these tribes, however, were until recently constantly at war and conflict with one another, forming different constellations of alliances and engaging in constant warfare. Some larger tribes managed to gain a certain level of recognition, temporarily subjugating neighboring villages through their own strength, but hostilities were ever present, and no single tribe could ever dominate all of the others. And this state of war only ended with the appearance of Demiurge, as he and his demons systematically conquered the region, organizing the warriors of the tribes into a unified and organized military, and the various leaders were either eliminated or enticed through the promise of rich rewards, honor and recognition in battle, or the opportunity to mate with powerful beings by joining Demiurge's or rather Yaldabaoth's side. But kidnapping of kings and queens was also not a uncommon or unheard of way of making entire tribes follow him. And it's important to note that Demiurge ruled with great repression, meaning even the slightest dissent, insolence, or failure to immediately follow orders often resulted in people being punished, and for example, being at least skinned alive a bit. Additionally, Demiurge exterminated all those tribes that refused to submit and be controlled by him, meaning that he completely eradicated them entirely and handed over the liberated land to others. Also, various test subjects were involuntarily introduced for various medical experiments, as Demiurge still sought to find out how one can have children across species boundaries, specifically between a heteromorph and a human woman. In the world of Overlord, this is normally not possible, or it is only achievable by the Dragon Lords of old, who actually managed to impregnate human women. Anyhow, through his conquest and various strategies and alliances, Demiurge or rather Yaldabaoth himself was perceived quite differently, because some followed him voluntarily, mainly due to the prospect of loot, but generally, he is still seen as more of a tyrant, dictator and oppressor, rather than a leader one is willingly following. And the pacification of the Hills of Abalion is, to reveal a bit more of the story, also part of the overall world conquest strategy, because now that the Sorcerer Kingdom has been established as a political entity, now that Ainz has to worry about his political image as a king, and what other nations might think of his own nation, their open atrocities would not only have political consequences, but also might jeopardize Ainz utopia plan, because people would fear him again too much, and instead of joining his reign, they would flee in sheer terror, as they did after the conquest of Irantel. So from Nezuric's perspective, it's a win-win situation, as Demiurge, in his role as Yaldabaoth, eliminates problematic demi-human and heteromorph tribes, and suppresses the rest, because then Ainz appears as even more benevolent compared to Yaldabaoth the Demon Emperor, despite being undead. And once everything is over, and Ainz is free to annex the region into his own realm, he wouldn't have to commit any atrocities, because they all have been committed. Furthermore, Demiurge still has the ability to, and will actually summon and command demons to aid his army in crucial moments. In other words, while the army is mostly made up of demi-humans and heteromorphs, occasionally they will receive support from summoned demons. And Demiurge also emphasized that demons at the very best have only a rudimentary knowledge of what is expected of them. Therefore, they also require clear and unambiguous orders in order to not overreact. And the theme of lesser demons being harder to control is also constantly present in Overlord, which I'm sure will be important later, if not in the Holy Kingdom arc. Additionally, the leadership of the army and coordination on individual fronts and cities is also left to some demons at the very top. So in other words, while local tribal leaders have some power, demons, even though they don't constitute the majority of the army, are in actuality the ones who will ultimately be calling the shots. And lastly, I want to highlight a rather special force, namely the Pleiades battlemaids themselves, who, in their role as magical maids, will fight alongside Demiurge, or rather Yaldabaoth, assisting him and presenting themselves as a tempting magical target, a prize worthy of a king. So therefore, they will become crucial in the later parts of the story, both for Yaldabaoth's army and Ainz plans at the Holy Kingdom's side. And while apart from the Pleiades, the army might initially seem like Demiurge gathered everything that can bite and then threatened it into becoming his soldier, and that he will be letting them simply loose, and then have a horde of beasts at his command, the army is in fact drilled, disciplined, and capable of executing complex strategies. It is not a wild horde that charges in blindly. Rather, it includes artillery, ranged units, and clever strategies and tactics designed to exploit the weaknesses of the Holy Kingdom and of humans in general, so it is a very competent force. Remedios Custodio, the Grand Master of the Paladin Order, has achieved the seemingly impossible. Despite a large-scale disinformation campaign and months of building an army of heteromorphs and demi-human auxiliary troops from the Hills of Abalion, which were preparing for an assault as part of a plan to conquer the Holy Kingdom in the name of the Archfiend, the great demon Emperor Yaldabaoth, she managed to see through this very deception, even though Yaldabaoth had already appeared in the Kingdom of Pleiades, independently from all of these events in the Abalion Hills, and the attack on the Holy Kingdom was only repulsed because of Momon, who had once driven Yaldabaoth out of the capital of Pleiades city, making him an enemy of the Demon Emperor himself. But again, despite all of this, Remedios realized that Yaldabaoth and Ainz were working together, that everything was just a show, and that both of them were secretly in league. Despite of Momon's previous fight against the so-called Demon Emperor, he also was likely in on this scheme, and Remedios figured out all of this. And this of course made the situation very dire for Ainz and for Demiurge. But Remedios, being completely tactless, announced her discovery, her insight, in front of the entire assembled company, including Gustave Montagnier, the vice commander of the Paladins, Prince Caspont, who had just been freed, as well as numerous other members of the Paladin Order, which was the reason why Ainz was ultimately able to keep his facade intact. Because this proves once again two things. First, even a blind hen sometimes bumps into a grain silo. And second, the action of a reasonably intelligent man are much more easy to predict than those of a complete fool. Remedios is a fanatical version of Philip, only in the Holy Kingdom, so her actions and therefore her insights were very hard to predict. Just as Ainz was the only person able to figure out that Philip was in truth just simply stupid. And the reason why Remedios was even able to come to this very correct conclusion was because she's extremely morally inflexible. Specifically, it's because of her faith, which was instilled in her by the general society and by the Holy Queen and her upbringing, and her belief made it clear that all undead are inherently evil. And that was that. No matter what the undead does, says, or how it behaves, it is still an undead, and therefore it is still evil, and will always be evil. So of course, in Remedios' mind, it must be always up to something. And of course this stands in complete contrast to how Ainz behaves from everyone else's perspective. He presented himself as humble, acted politely and respectfully towards the living, whom he should, technically speaking, hate as an undead, and he was very generous to Neia, who admired him more and more, and he even personally went to the front lines as the king of a neutral, but essentially a hostile nation, all for the sake and the greater good of the Holy Kingdom. Ainz also had revealed his true motive after all, because he supposedly wanted to win over Yaldabaoth's demon maids. So in the eyes of the other paladins, his motives and his reasoning for acting how he acted were completely transparent, so they know what was in it for the sorcerer king. But again, none of this mattered to Remedios. To her, Ainz must be evil because he is undead. So the only thing left to discover was his true evil motive. And thanks to her fanaticism, Remedios was truly able to find it, not in spite of, but because of her unwavering beliefs. She was the only one who resisted Ainz charm and held firmly to her ideals, and was therefore able to figure out what Ainz was actually truly planning, something that nobody else could find out. As the saying goes, an open mind is like a fortress with open gates and a lowered drawbridge, and it's shown that even fanaticism here, and a closed worldview in general, can also have their strengths, as long as one remains true to their own values. But luckily for Ainz Remedios herself has embarrassed and discredited herself with two major blunders already. Because when the Liberation Army of the Holy Kingdom, which at that time only consisted of a few hundred paladins, attempted to free a large camp of prisoners of war, and civilians for that matter, and initially had great success, it was Remedios who halted the attack, thus endangering thousands of lives in the process, because the leader of the internment camp had threatened the lives of a few children. And as harsh as it sounds, as a leader one should prioritize the lives of the thousands of prisoners over the lives of just a handful of prisoners. And don't get me wrong, Remedios wouldn't have to be blamed for this, if she made the decision to continue the attack under the external pressure that she was facing. It would have been the best possible decision after all, because the internment camp leader was the one who ultimately threatened the children's lives with his very own action. He alone bears the guilt. And he can also claim all he wants that Remedios is solely to blame, and that she had the choice, but I think everyone understands that one should never give in to such blatant attempts at extortion and blackmail. Ainz also made it clear that the enemy only takes hostages to blackmail, to gain advantages, and to basically better his own position in the first place, and that the hostages will become irrelevant as soon as they no longer serve the captor's interests. And if Remedios had been really clever, she could have asked Neia on the spot to step forwards, or asked for a volunteer paladin beforehand, and had them seriously injured, by herself of course, in front of the enemy leader, to show how little a human life supposedly mattered to her, and by proxy her army of zealots, thus reducing the value of the hostages to nil. Of course, this would have been just a show, and Neia or the paladin would have received healing magic immediately after it became clear that the hostages had no real value and nobody was looking, because everybody feared the attack of the paladins again, and that the focus should have been on the Grandmaster of the Paladin Order to begin with, who was the real threat to the leader's life. And that is now after you. So the focus would have completely shifted away from the hostages, just like it shifted away in the true canon story timeline, where Ainz used his fireball spell to roast the leader and the hostages, therefore showing that they had no value to him. But such clever tricks and deceptions were beyond Remedios' abilities to begin with, and she was stubborn and blind and basically learn-resistant enough to fall for the same hostage trick again. In other words, by that point, her credibility was already completely ruined. Moreover, she has always been, to sum it up, she had the reputation of being a bit of an airhead, and Remedios had openly outsourced her thinking to her crafty little sister Kelart Custodio, and Kelart was the only one who wasn't above using such intrigues and tricks if they served a good cause. And if she had been on the front lines, Ainz would have had a much harder time, because she would have been just as suspicious of the undead sorcerer king, but unlike Remedios, she could think further ahead. In other words, if Kelart had been involved, and if she had heard Remedios, she would have also realized that Ainz and Demiurge were in league with each other. Similar to how Hank figured basically Weiterwald's secret out in Breaking Bad by reading the same book. And even that wouldn't have been the end of the world, even if, not Hank of course, but if Remedios had been able to truly figure out that Ainz were up to something, and if Kelart had still been around to assist her, because by that time the leadership of the Holy Kingdom had been completely replaced, and Caspont, the prince they seemingly freed, had just been a doppelganger from the very start. Remedios therefore would also have been a doppelganger at some point later in the story, and that would have been a problem because Neia likely would have noticed and not trusted Ainz the way she did in the original story, because she know how Remedios is, and she know how she will behave. So while the Holy Kingdom would have still fallen under the Sorcerer King's sway, Neia wouldn't become the fanatic zealot that would ultimately ensure that it will stay true to Ainz. And with that said, I think that's all for today. And now it's your turn. What do you think could have happened if Remedios had remained true to her conviction and even passed on this information to someone like Larkius or Platinum Dragonlord, or really anyone else that have great power? Again, let me know it down in the comment section. And with that said, please check out my German channel, my fantasy channel, and if you don't want to listen to my voice or accent, but are still interested in the things I have to say, I have made an AI channel, where I use AI voice covers for my video, and the channels are all linked down in the video description. Also please check out my Patreon if you want to support me beyond just leaving a like or sub. Remedios Custodio was never the brightest candle on the cake, and actually not even on the cake. The reason why she is the way she is and acts the way she does is because she has a self-contained worldview that cannot be changed from the outside anymore. And this is in part because of her personality, but also in part because Remedios Custodio, like the overwhelming majority of the population of the Holy Kingdom, adheres to a faith based on the four gods of earth, air, water, and fire. This is in stark contrast to the theocracy of Slain, which is based on a system of 6 gods. And the origin of both religious movements seems to lie with those 6 players who came to the New World 600 years ago and saved humanity from certain death at the very last second, giving them the gift of magic as a way to defend themselves against the monsters of this very world. And the 6 players consisted of 4 human players and 1 elven player, as well as a heteromorphic undead player named Zurshana. And the 4 human players were associated with the elements of air, earth, water and fire, while Zurshana represented death and darkness, and the elven player represented light and life. And due to the fact that these 2 players were not human, almost all nations, except for the theocracy of Slain, who indeed pretends that these 2 were humans to their own citizen, removed these 2 beings from their pantheon over the centuries. So only the 4 human players continued to be worshipped as gods. And no one would know today that they were once players, or what players actually are. This of course has led to many religious conflicts with the theocracy, and Remedios is also firmly entrenched in their belief in the 4 gods. In other words, her religious teachings are set in stone and are not questioned or just interpreted, and Remedios has fared quite well with this worldview. She is a natural talent when it comes to swordsmanship and left the thinking part to her smarter sister, Kelart Custodio. And her strong faith gives her an unwavering will to endure even the greatest hardships and pain to fight for justice. And this is also reflected in her devout loyalty to the Holy Queen Calca Besares. And Calca, due to her status as the Holy Queen, is also a religious authority. Therefore her position, thoughts, and political demands are also of religious significance to Remedios, and it is essential for her to follow Calca's words and instructions to the letter, and never question them. And this is where the problem lies. The literal following of supposedly divine laws and rulers, who are completely honest and genuinely want the best for everyone, still reaches its limits, when reality doesn't work the way religious scriptures say it should, or in this case, the orders of the Holy Queen. In other words, Remedios' stubbornness stems from her desire to do only what is right, and anyone who does not want to do what is right is either evil or has not understood that everyone simply needs to do the right thing for everything and everyone to be fine. And again, as far as we know, her faith is based on the mistaken assumption that the 6 or rather the 4 players who came to the New World in their in-game avatars were divine beings. But again, Remedios doesn't know that, and she can't question or interrogate her own religious text and scriptures for such things. And of course she wouldn't do such a thing, because this would be blasphemy. So in this sense, for her, any deviation from a religious dogma is also a sin and a step towards evil, so she can't step away from it. And this is exactly why Remedios is so inflexible and rigid in her views, and why she can be essentially checkmated on a mental level. For if her queen orders Remedios to do everything to protect the lives of the weakest members of society, the poor children, and to never endanger their lives, even during a war, then, from both Calca's and Remedios' perspectives, there's only the best of intentions here, and no ill will. But what if the children are held hostage by the enemy faction, which then demands that all combat operations against them cease? In that case, Remedios cannot fight evil without endangering the children, which again would be evil, and therefore it can't be done. And she cannot save the children, which she has to, without fighting the evil that she can't fight anymore. In other words, due to this logical flaw in her faith, Remedios can essentially crash like a computer in the real world, She could freeze like a computer because of logic errors and let's put it that way, a very, very limited amount of processing power. And this story, this aspect of Remedios, not only has a pretty clear warning against dogma, but I think it also has a connection to Japanese society, because just as it is customary in Germany to still use fax machines and overhead projectors and to essentially keep technological advancement away from offices and institutions because that's how we've always done it, Japan has a similar problem with its stamps and fax machines as well, which many Japanese companies, offices, and bureaus still suffer from. It's this inflexibility, even if it fails clearly, and the inability of those in power to address this failing that is criticized here in this very metaphor of Remedios. And thus Remedios' character also has a meta level to it, meant to highlight the problems of stubbornness and blind dogma. But it goes even further, because the sad part of this whole story is not only Remedios, but this goes even further, because the sad part, apart from Remedios being in it, of this entire story is that Neia, and this is something that is rarely mentioned in the discussion about Overlord, becomes over the course of the story and over the course of her experiences a sort of Remedios Custodio 2.0. Let me explain briefly. When Remedios Custodio and her troops halted their attack on a small town occupied by the enemy, after the enemy threatened to eliminate human children and the rest of the hostages as well, if the previously successful offensive wasn't immediately halted, Remedios, torn between her oath, her faith, her worldview, and her fear of endangering the children, desperately searched for a solution, but she still halted the advance, much to the delight of the enemy. But after ideologically boxing herself into a corner and seeing no way out, she became increasingly enraged, uncontrollable, and more desperate and illogical. And in a similar way, Neia found herself at a similar point during the story. When Ainz, gone after a long and grueling battle with the demon Emperor Yaldabaoth, or at least the supposed demon Emperor Yaldabaoth, fell, defeated from the sky, apparently gravely wounded, and landed somewhere deep in enemy territory, far away in the Hills of Abalion, which were firmly in Yaldabaoth's hands. Neia was gripped by the same religious panic, the same crisis in her worldview, the same desperation, the same terror, and the same helpless, furious, and irrational anger that Remedios displayed when her own offensive was halted. So even though Remedios Custodio acted very foolishly, irrationally, and narrow-mindedly, and was therefore rightfully ridiculed and despised by the Overlord community, especially because she treated Neia so abysmally, Neia, in that critical moment when Ainz fell from the sky before her own eyes, the man she admired for solving her problems, apparently have failed. In that very moment, Neia's health had become just as bad as Remedios, with her demands and her screeching. It was like watching Remedios' personality and character flaws mirrored onto her. And I want to emphasize at this point that this escalation happened relatively early on her religious journey, even before she massively converted people and held sermons in public places in the name of Ainz, whom she now worships as justice. By the time of the events at the end of Season 4, which play out after the events of the Holy Kingdom, when the capital city of Riestais received the declaration of war from the Sorcerer Kingdom, Neia and her signature was among the most important ones on the declaration, because other nations, such as the Empire under Emperor Jerknev, again just a puppet, but also the Dragon Kingdom and the Dwarven Kingdom, supported this declaration of war as well. And for the Holy Kingdom, Neia co-signed this declaration of war in support of Ainz, which means that she had now way more power and largely converted the Holy Kingdom to her own faith and became such a central religious authority that despite only being a squire just a few months or at least a year prior, and not even a fully fledged paladin, she ascended so much that she was able to sign the documents with her own signature. She became extremely powerful in her own right, under the hidden tutelage of Ainz minions, and therefore she now stands in line with the Regency Council, which represents the Dwarven King in his absentee, with the Queen of an entire nation, the Queen of the Holy Kingdom, Draudilon Riculus, and Emperor Jerknev. Neia therefore has likely deeply entrenched herself even further into this Remedios mindset, and had become solidified in her worldviews. In other words, even though we as the viewer find Neia somewhat more likable than Remedios Custodio, which to be fair isn't that hard, because Neia Baraya can at the very least somewhat perceive Ainz ability and personality from her own perspective and from our perspective, and while she is essentially what Janus and later Fubuki or King are in One Punch Man, the ones who are the only ones to understand how strong Saitama is, Neia, because of this, loses that more objective and rational view of the world that she once had, and drenched herself in religious fervor. In other words, while in most anime, we usually see the protagonist first and what they can do and what they can't do, before we see sort of a dark twin or twist on the entire personality and character of the hero, that is then later introduced to the show, to show what could go wrong. But in Overlord instead, we have someone like Remedios Custodio, to whom Neia has partially already become similar. And that is kind of tragic. And just like Remedios, Neia will now take the words and actions of a player, Ainz, as a divine command, and as pure justice, even though we know how often Ainz is himself uncertain shown in anime would present as their main character, a bold and brash archetype that is very, very simple-minded. Like Naruto, for example, she wouldn't understand or come up with complex plans and strategies, so everybody else has to explain them to her. Like Naruto, she holds on to an unrealistic worldview, and Remedios, especially after the loss of the Holy Queen, has no practical means to implement her goals into the real world. And yet she still believes in them. Naruto's catchphrase is literally a part of her worldview. And last but not least, to her, every problem can be solved with enough force. So like so many others, Remedios is a blunt, battle-focused anime protagonist, only without all of the benefits of being the main character. Now, focusing on the thing you're good at is nothing wrong, quite the contrary. Gazef Stronov obtained his position by his merit as a fighter. If he hadn't had such a tunnel vision and instead would have tried to train himself as a mage, as a tactician, and as a potion maker, he would likely have lived a life in obscurity. Being a jack of all trades oftentimes means you are a master of none. Not to mention that Brain Anglos is kind of a meme for having a level in Cook, which might be the reason for why he is slightly weaker than Gazef. And in our own real world, focusing all of your efforts to obtain one very specific but high-paying occupation will usually yield a better overall lifetime income than if you were able to take on basically any low-skilled job in existence. Sure, the low-skilled generalist will always be able to find work, while somebody who is specialized in a single programming language might be out of a job for good, if this language is not in demand anymore. But overall, specialization is one of the most vital economic tools the individual has. And as far as gaming, D&D and Overlord in particular is concerned, min-maxing your character is a common strategy for optimization. So then why is Gazef such a well-rounded character while Remedios is not? In contrast to Remedios, who spent her days with the princess and her idealistic dreams, and took on an even more unrealistic black and white worldview based on those ideas, Gazef Stronov was trained by the adventurer Vestur Klov de Leuven, a man of noble birth, but one who spent his life traveling, fighting, and thereby constantly risking everything he had for the sake of other people. And therefore Vestor presumably also had a great many experiences, from the inner workings of the noble society to the life of an adventurer to that of ordinary people. And since the Adventurer Guild is a pan-national organization, he could even compare different noble societies and understand the difference between, for example, the life of a commoner in the capital of Riestais and the life of a commoner in Aventar, the capital city of the empire. And last but not least, Gazef himself lived most of his life surrounded by commoners. He experienced how complex and morally grey a society can be. And of course, being under constant scrutiny by the noble faction has taught him at the very least to be patient and how to control himself. And while he too would make decisions that are ultimately detrimental to the overall country and purely based on them being good and righteous, like for example be willing to ride into an ambush of the Sunlight Scripture so that the villagers might escape, while losing his own life and that of his fellow soldiers, which would have greatly weakened the kingdom. And of course challenging Ainz to a duel was not the best idea. But Gazef at the very least can treat others with respect, even if they turn out to be undead. Gazef drawn off and faced with the massacre of the Cat's Plain still acknowledged that Ainz, the undead overlord, was the same guy that had saved Karn and his own life from certain death, and was therefore deserving of respect. Compare this to Remedios' Custodio. Her worldview is simple, dogmatic, black and white, and she will gladly ignore evidence that would contradict her ideas and ideals how the world should be when directly confronted with them. Ainz, despite not being involved with the Holy Kingdom at all, and seen as the enemy of all life by them, is willing to personally help the kingdom by risking his own unlife. Remedios' only counter to this: well, he's undead and therefore evil. Irantel is a safe, secure and prosperous city where humans, demi-humans, the undead, other heteromorphs are all living together in peace, harmony and prosperity. Well, he is still undead. Ainz, the overpowered overlord, is friendly and magnanimous to all of the paladins, even though he's their enemy number one. Well, he is undead, so it must be an act. Ainz sacrifices a huge portion of his mana to save the city and Remedios herself from certain death. But did you know that he is undead? And even though she's spot on with her suspicion that Ainz and Yaldabaoth are working together, she merely came to this right conclusion out of spite, prejudice and hatred, rather than through thought and analytical insight. Yaldabaoth is evil, the undead are evil, and therefore the two might work together. Remedios is the kind of person that would look at a complex mathematical problem, write a completely random digit at the end of it, because it's her lucky number, and is somehow right by accident. Neither would she fully understand how she arrived at her correct conclusion. She also couldn't convince anybody else that this is indeed the right conclusion, since she lacks any working argument. So in a sense, most of us are a little bit like Remedios. Seriously though, her inability to understand complex situation leads to rash accusations and misjudgments. For example, Remedios accused her own sister Kelart Custodio of failing at her job as a strategist and advisor because Yaldabaoth and his army had invaded the Holy Kingdom. She says this because in Remedios' mind all she needs to do is kill things and protect the Holy Queen in order to completely succeed at her job, while all her sister needs to do is to make plans that actually work. And while this concept is correct in principle, it completely fails in reality. By the way, this is something of a theme with Remedios and to a lesser extent Calca. No matter how good of a strategist, advisor and politician Kelart Custodio is, given the divide between the North and South, the demi-human at their doorsteps, the many political adversaries Calca had, and the overall laws of physics and their level caps, even in this new world, there was no way for Kelart Custodio to come up with a plan that could have stopped Demiurge in a disguise as a demon emperor from uniting the Abalion hill tribes and invade the Holy Kingdom. It was simply not a viable option, no matter how hard Kelart would have tried. But of course Remedios couldn't wrap her head around this, even believing that she would easily be able to kill Yaldabaoth since a single adamantite adventurer managed to rout him. Of course, Remedios failed to understand that the adamantite rank is simply a catch-of-all terms for the most powerful adventurers, and that there's a considerable power difference even between members of the same team. This willful ignorance constantly and predictably leads to huge misjudgments and a general oversight of basically any finer details. Her rash and sometimes oblivious statements and demands, and her understanding of the world are childlike, and once her sister and her queen that thus far have navigated Remedios through the more complex parts of basically anything died. This character flaw was laid bare. And even worse, Neia, our point of view character for most of the books, became an outlet for her anger, even though Remedios made the same experiences Neia had. Instead of adjusting her belief system until it can work in reality, she adamantly tries to force an incompatible ideal onto an unwilling world, and all of the completely foreseeable consequences may be damned. Remedios had run into basically the same trap twice, and I'm not talking about the Twin Guardians. Instead of being willing to sacrifice the life of a few hostages in order to liberate a huge portion of her people, Remedios halted the advance of her troops and gave the enemy time to prepare, thus making far greater sacrifices necessary than before. And when confronted with these consequences, Remedios simply loses it. So in conclusion, Remedios is a character that tries desperately to force her unrealistic ideals that paint the world in right and wrong, black and white, good and evil, onto a morally complex, grey world, while being an absolutely condescending, insufferable, abusing, belittling hypocrite that is mean for no real reason to one of the main characters of 2 books. And the last point I want to make is that Remedios Custodio, a in principle good and just character, is nearly irredeemable in the eyes of the audience. Let me illustrate what I mean by this. In Harry Potter, the character of Dolores Umbridge is easily more hated than Voldemort. She threatens, intimidates, belittles, overregulates, and tortures the kids she should have protected. And in contrast to a nearly invincible dark evil dictator wizard with the most powerful wand in existence, a person, be it a teacher, a boss, a landlord, or really anybody else, with authority that delights in using this power over you in order to make your life miserable, is something we all know from real life. That's why in Harry Potter fandom Dolores Umbridge is more disliked than Voldemort. But this greater evil could be used to redeem her. By having Umbridge take a stance against Voldemort, she would join the good side, because she now faces against a greater evil. This is how a lot of evil characters are getting saved and redeemed. I mean, sure, Darth Vader was evil, but ultimately the Emperor, who manipulated him and drove him to the dark side, is the true culprit of his fall. He sent him visions of his dying mother, and after she died, Palpatine tormented him with visions of the death of the love of his life. So clearly part of the blame lies with him. Likewise, Jaime Lannister's the way he is, or rather the way he was, because his father Tywin, a cold, prideful and Machiavellian politician, greatly contributed to Jaime's narcissism, pride, arrogance, and even to the incest part by neglecting the twins. Besides that, Ramsay Bolton and Euron Greyjoy are arguably the more evil villainous persons. So by contrast, Jaime looks better. But here's the thing with Overlord. As far as I and probably a huge portion of the fanbase is concerned, we would gladly see a nearly invincible dark evil dictator wizard with the most powerful staff in existence to conquer the world. We would really like his 10,000-year plan to succeed. We really liked his pseudo-Machiavellian schemes that had led to the annexation of the Empire as a vassal state. And even though Ainz, and Demiurge are part of the reason for why Remedios became such an incredible, disliked person, to say the very least. After the Happy Farm, the narrowly avoided genocide of the Lizardmen, after the death of Arche, after Splat and the culling of the Quagoar, after everything the other denizens of Nazarick had done to the innocent and guilty alike, We don't really care about traditional evil anymore. But we all know a person like Remedios from real life, and likely had to suffer under her for a period of time. And this also makes her kind of a tragic character. I mean, think about it. Aside from being an asshole all of the time, which again can be said about many anime characters, Remedios is already a good person, trying her hardest to protect her people, even if it would cost her life, and what little sanity she had in the first place. While she surely has a problematic character, she's ultimately a war veteran that has gone and is currently going through hell, with no way out. She lost her queen, the one that promised to create a country where everybody would be happy, well fed, safe and cared for. And she lost her sister, not only her own flesh and blood, but also the person that could resurrect her queen if need be. And like Jaime Lannister, her entire life was to be a guard. Her name Custodio even translates to guardian and protector. And while Jaime Lannister sacrificed his honor and broke an oath to save the people of King's Landing from a death in fire and other Amon Amarth songs, Remedios would also have sacrificed anything she had. And despite all of her best efforts, she still failed. So it is no wonder that she is an unstable character. And despite all of this, since Remedios is like a typical anime protagonist, dumb, brash, loud, impulsive, with an unrealistic ideal she means to bring upon the world via excessive use of force, while being a condescending prick to Neia, our point of view character, she is our Dolores Umbridge. And while we are rooting for our own Lord Voldemort, Remedios represents a common archetype we couldn't stand in the first place or fell out of love with a long time ago. And that's why we dislike her so much. Now, Kelart was 2 years younger than her big sister, and the complete opposite character-wise. She had the face of an angel, the heart of a devil, who was very cautious, calm, and intelligent, preferring to actually think things through, rather than act headlessly. Ironic, I know. Kelart alongside her sister was also seen as the twin wings that kept the queen afloat, Remedios being Calca's fist, while Kelart was more subtle, able to come up with tactics, strategies, intelligence, and manipulative schemes in order to secure Calca's throne and protect her country. And as the head priestess, she could also be relied to rally the temples of the Holy Kingdom to support her, thus being in a very valuable position, especially if we consider that the Holy Kingdom is definitely, at least in part, a theocracy. Kelart Custodio was also more powerful than the adamantite-ranked Lachios of Blue Roses, at least when it comes to pure priestess power, and therefore she would easily have been deserving of a color, but she didn't receive one. And she kept her ability to cast 5th tier magic, a secret, all in order to preserve the political peace, and as a trump card, should anyone try to launch a coup d'etat against her queen, since the nobility saw the growing power of Calca with disdain. Kelart would have still a final ace in her sleeves, and as a compromise, since it would make the nobility very uncomfortable to know that one of the 9 colors, one that could use 5th tier magic, supports their enemy, she didn't become one. And speaking of this conflict, when it came to defending her queen, Kelart was even more aggressive and certainly more vicious in her counterattacks than even Remedios. Though considering her intellect, she could keep up a grudge and strike back more subtly, being willing to do more tasteless acts than her sister would be able to do, since again, Remedios is a lawful good paladin, while Kelart has lower, but not negative karma. Now, aside from her understanding of politics and being the head priestess, one of the reasons why so many nobles opposed Calca Besaris was not only that she was the first queen, but that she was also husbandless, which led to rumors that she had an affair with both of the Custodio sisters, which again are called her twin wings, so them being at her back might have been a common joke among her detractors. Though we at the very least know that Remedios hadn't had any bodily relationship with Calca, she was just a loyal, lawful good knight. Kelart, on the other hand, could very well be the Holy Queen's lover, and would actually be able to keep quiet about it. Well, outside of the bedroom at least. And for some reason I always imagine Remedios standing outside of the Holy Queen's chamber, hearing all manners of sounds and movements going on, and rather than realizing what is actually happening, or why the Holy Queen is praying so loudly, and to her sisters of all people, repeating, "Oh my god, Kelart, don't stop," all the time. She just assumes that this is how strategic planning works, and that divination is somehow very pleasant and exciting. I honestly wouldn't put it past her, since she stands as a neutron star under pressure. Of course, this happy future, or really any, wasn't destined to be, because fate, or rather Nezarec, had sent out the demon Emperor Yaldabaoth to unite the demi-humans of the Abalion Hills, and to pillage the Holy Kingdom. His attack on the northern capital led to the death of not only Calca, by using her as a club, but also to Kelart's. Now Kelart, as mentioned being very headstrong in nature, was actually given a position befitting her talents. After Yaldabaoth concluded his assault, Kelart, or rather her head, became one of the two casting items wielded by the Circlet demon that battled Neia and Shizo Delta during the 13th novel. And last but not least, the spells Kelart had mastered were very descriptive of her character. Blindness could, well, blind her enemies, or metaphorically speaking, mislead them. Holy Ray is an expression of herself fighting for the Holy Queen and all that is good in the world, smiting her enemies with pure radiance. Shockwave illustrates how explosive and wrathful Kelart, who is usually more calm and calculated, can be when her Holy Queen is attacked. Ray's dead, one of her 50 spells, shows that she is willing and able to do tasteless acts and manipulate people in order to achieve her queen's goals. And open wounds not only enhances any damage her enemies would take, it also highlights her piercing gaze and her sharp tongue. And of course, as not just any priestess, but as the head priestess, Kelart held dominion over many angels. So as you can tell, and as usual, her character, a side character at best, is really well thought out, detailed, and consistent, without really playing a big role in the overall story of the double volume. And again, this is precisely why I love Overlord so much. We will start with the Holy Queen, Calca Bezaris. First and foremost, she is a powerful holy magic user, somewhere between Fluda Paradane and one of his elite students power-wise. Calca is a comparably young queen of 25 years of age that ascended to the top of her country by essentially being virtuous, while the support of the strongest paladin Remedios Custodio, one of the 9 colors, and the advice of her more pragmatic sister Kelart Custodio had undoubtedly contributed to Calca being able to claim the throne. It was ultimately her honest, virtuous behavior, her vision of ending hunger, poverty, injustice, crime, and war in her country that garnered her the support of the common people and convinced Cuspon Bezaris, Calca's older brother, to decline his birthright of becoming the Holy King in favor of the first Holy Queen. While all of this was done with the benefit of the country in mind, it greatly angered the southern part of the Holy Kingdom. With the nation divided by a great bay, the two parts needed to be kept in a delicate balance in order for the two to work together. Any shift in power could lead to half of the kingdom gaining dominance over both parts, which would not necessarily lead to a unification due to distance and distrust, but to exploitation of whatever part is inferior at the time. Driven to change the power balance in their favor, most of the southern nobility heavily disliked and distrusted Calca, and there were even rumors that the still unmarried queen had a lesbian relationship with both of the Custodio sisters, which sounds plausible on paper until you realize that one of them would be Remedios. And I don't take her to be a person that could guard secrets as well as she guarded the Holy Queen. So while Calca became queen, she is by no means an absolute monarch. And while Calca acts in the overall interest of the realm and the people within, she is not above using her beauty to her advantage. and she even invented an anti-aging spell for younger, more vital skin. Though this might have been Kelart's idea since she's a more pragmatic-minded tactician, strategist, and advisor. Interestingly, beauty has a measurable effect on people. Aside from more sex appeal, beautiful people tend to be ascribed better moral behavior, intentions, and are seen as overall more competent. And this is part of the so-called halo effect. Like Queen Calca, Princess Renner is seen as incredibly beautiful, and she is also loved by the common folk, and admired not only for her beauty, but also for her political reforms, earning her the byname of Golden Princess. Thanks to her enduring efforts, slavery was ended in the kingdom of Pleiades. But while Calca is honestly a good person, Renner is different, to put it mildly. While growing up Renner, due to her intellect, she couldn't relate to anybody. Her ideas were ill understood by her surrounding or brushed aside altogether. This disconnect at an early age led to Renner developing anorectic behavior as a coping mechanism, and it wasn't even clear if Renner would make it to adulthood, until she found Climb, a boy of common descent on the verge of death. His eyes, the way he looked at her, full of honest admiration and adornment, sparked, let's call it love. But since Renner is damaged, this love manifested as something between a very unhealthy obsession and a fetish, since Renner fantasizes about him being chained up like a dog, unable to escape. And in a sense, he is already her dog, since Climb acts as the personal bodyguard of Renner, and also represents her on the battlefield. In contrast to Calca, Renner, at least thus far, hasn't shown any magical or martial abilities, but she is very good at acting in her Golden Princess persona. Furthermore, and in similar contrast to Calca, Renner lacks any real political power. As the third princess, both of her sisters were already married for political reasons, with Renner also likely being already promised to somebody from the noble faction, since there was a mention about a certain noble that looked at her like he already owns her. So while the kingdom of Pleiades, like the Holy Kingdom, is divided between two opposing political factions, the royalist faction centering around King Ramposar and the second son of him, and the noble faction wanting to install Prince Barbaro, a good-looking, strong, tall, but politically absolutely inept prince, as the new king in order to control him. Neither of the older brothers would support Renner on the throne, or even consider such a proposition. So Renner, in stark contrast to Calca, has little to no direct political influence, and heavily relies on the gravitas and authority of other persons in order to advance her goals. And since her only real allies, the adamantite adventurer Team Blue Roses, lacks any direct political influence, and is in fact even forbidden by guild rules from directly supporting Renner, there simply is no direct way for Renner to get what she wants. And after the death of the older brother Barbaro at Lupus Regina's hand, the younger one had already taken over the day-to-day government affairs, since King Ramposar was unable to lead the country. Judging by his look after the massacre at the Cat's Plain, the king's mental health was greatly damaged, and his body seems to follow his mind. But it is also unlikely that Prince Zenek will reign for long. Not only is the newly founded Sorcerer Kingdom about to invade, even before the founding of Ainz's new realm, the Great Tomb of Nezarick was already allied to Renner, or rather it made Renner an incredible valuable pawn. Remember, Renner's aim was never to bring everybody happiness and joy. She only pretended to be a good person in order to satisfy Climb, going so far in her act as to propose laws and economic reforms at the most disopportune of time, in order to show Climb what a supposedly good person she is, as well as gaining a pretext to get more attention out of him, by pretending to be devastated every time her ideas were turned down. Renner tries everything to bind Climb closer to her, and to push any competition out of the way, and her keen understanding of the many intrigues at court, and about where certain spies are, and what she needed to tell them, was so great that she was able to indirectly murder the slaves Climb saved from the horror brothel by telling one of the maids / spies where the rescued slaves were currently at. Climb, and pretty much the rest of Pleiades, utterly lacking the ability to see through the complex plans and plots, has no other choice as to perceive Renner as a genuinely good person, and he wants nothing more than her to be happy, and to be with her. But here's the problem: since Climb is a mere commoner, and Renner is a princess, the society in general, and the current divide between nobility and the king in particular, would not allow for a love match to happen. To put it simple, Renner's goal is Climb, and she will reach it by any means necessary, no matter the cost. So while Queen Calca is able and willing to compromise, in order to keep the balance between the north and the south intact, Renner, in order to achieve her goal, must destroy the noble faction and take over the royal one. And this is what truly distincts the two: the willingness to make sacrifices and break laws and any moral code necessary to achieve their goal. This becomes obvious when confronted with a rather problematic challenger. Both Renner and Calca were confronted with Demiurge in the disguise of Yaldabaoth and an incoming invasion. But Demiurge, being a highly intelligent being, blessed with demonic wisdom, was able to figure out Renner's true personality simply by receiving observations about the way she acted and presented herself. Acknowledging Renner's moral flexibility, her real Machiavellian personality, and possibly noticing her ability to govern, that is unmatched even by Albedo. He and Albedo decided to make her a pawn. And curious enough, Albedo seems to like her, with the two even discussing their respective obsessions, and Albedo even called Renner a heteromorph in spirit, due to her amoral pursuit of her own goal. So one could take away from this that a good person, a genuinely good person, would never distrust her friends or even hurt them, and therefore a more moral flexible person would only need to pretend to be good, while offering potential evil adversaries a reason to ally with them. And since Renner sneakily displayed her value as a lawmaker/economist, the Empire of Baharut, for example, wanted to keep her alive, despite Emperor Jerknev's personal dislike for her. So Renner, like Littlefinger in Game of Thrones, managed to play all sides, and with her being able and willing to use any situation to her own advantage, she may ultimately survive and reign the kingdom of Riestais as an underling of the Sorcerer King. A position comparable to an area guardian. So while Renner will likely eventually take over Riestais and rule it to the best of her abilities in order to maintain Climb's image of her, as well as to stay on good terms with the Sorcerer Kingdom, at the very end, the general populace might be better off after suffering through a brief demonic invasion, a single decisive defeat, and an all-out invasion that will be the topic of the 14th novel. This, despite being horrible, is overall a better outcome when compared to what already has happened to the Holy Kingdom. Similar how the Kingdom of Riestais will be invaded by the Sorcerer Kingdom, the Holy Kingdom already has been invaded by Demiurge in the disguise of Yaldabaoth. However, instead of it being a brief incursion, with the aim of punishing and subduing the Eight Fingers, a powerful crime syndicate that was at the very least able to threaten the royal family in person, the Holy Kingdom faced a full-on demon-led beastman invasion. The people of the northern half of the kingdom were imprisoned in what can only be described as happy farms, a demon-governed prison where prisoners are repeatedly skinned alive. And the Liberation Army also suffered great losses in their fight against Yaldabaoth. And now the ruined north is not only powerless against the as of yet untouched south, but this constellation, along with the doppelganger Holy King in place, will inevitably lead to another bloody civil war that will only end when the Sorcerer Kingdom yet again invades and pacifies the nation by any means necessary. So in addition to suffering even greater than the kingdom had, the Holy Kingdom will likely face everything the Kingdom of Riestais will have to endure in the 14th novel, and a devastating civil war on top of it. So while Renner was able to make a compromise with Demiurge, and in turn gain power and her life's goal, Calca, the Holy Queen, who compared to Renner had it easier in life, was due to her staunch ideals unable to compromise and thereby defend her country. And I'm not only talking about a pact with Demiurge, but about the ongoing religious conflict with the theocracy, and the unwillingness of Calca to sacrifice the well-being of a few in order to ensure the survival of the many, also reflected strongly on Remedios, who refused to sacrifice the life of a few hostages in order to allow her liberation army to free an entire city. And on a national scale, the Great Wall, while being a strong deterrent, would even without Demiurge's interference failed to keep the nation safe, for the very reason that with most of the populace, both men and women, serving in the militia, the economy would collapse before the invading army could even be halted, and the war won. The pragmatic solution to this situation would be to reject religious dogma and sound moral principles in order to mend the damaged diplomatic relationship with the slain theocracy. Without the religious differences, the state of the 6 great gods would likely help the young queen in her endeavor to secure the western border of the kingdom. With a combined effort of the scriptures, the Paladin Order, and the Adventurer Guild, the Abalion Hills could have been pacified before Nezarick even arrived in the New World. With this direct threat destroyed, and a powerful ally gained, Calca could have then focused fully on strengthening the economy and thereby achieving her ideals. But Calca's unwillingness to abandon or at least alter her moral code, and if necessary suppress dissent among the religious populace by force, bribes, or really any means necessary, meant that the Holy Kingdom stayed without the theocracy's aid, and thereby was left vulnerable to a total defeat. In Overlord, sometimes small atrocities are required in order to prevent larger ones, and good intentions might not necessarily lead to good outcomes. That said, let's take a look at Calca Bizarre's perspective first, for the kind queen of the Holy Kingdom is actually quite compassionate, and only wants the best for her subjects. And we have been given an illustration of how precisely her decision-making process would be if she would have been confronted with a difficult moral question. Let's say a young demi-human, the same subset of species that is known to plunder the Holy Kingdom and eat its citizens for generations, the very species that is the reason that they had to create the New World's version of the Hadrian's Wall, would somehow grow up in a human society and become a good friend with a human child. If this situation would have been presented to the Holy Queen as I just described it, then Calca would allow this, and only this demi-human, to live out its life in peace. The demi-human, despite what his kind did to the Holy Queen's people, would not be hunted down or killed, as long as it doesn't attack anyone. But if Remedios Custodio would hear about it, then she would kill the demi-human kid without any hesitation or second thoughts, or thoughts at all for that matter. To her, the question of whether or not this demi-human in particular deserves to be killed is not even existent in the first place. Her logic and her judgment only comes in absolutes. If demi-humans attack and plunder the Holy Kingdom, if they kill and eat the citizens she had been sworn to protect, then the head paladin's mind is clear. Demi-humans are evil, and it doesn't even matter where they grow up, or if a demi-human did nothing wrong until now. Demi-humans are evil. The demi-human kid growing up in a human village is still a demi-human, and therefore, despite it personally having done nothing wrong yet, must be evil as well. So in the fraction of a second, Remedios will judge the demi-human kid as evil and kill it. And the head paladin will be very confused if the human child starts to cry and accuse her of being bad, since clearly she did nothing wrong. She did nothing but a good deed, and she did it only to protect the villagers from a demi-human threat in their midst. Clearly the kid is wrong, as well as her parents, and as well as the entire village growing up that accepted the demi-human as one of their own. They made the mistake, not Remedios. So despite her lawful good nature, Remedios is like a Sith Lord. She only deals in absolutes. She only can distinguish between black and white, good or evil. Her worldview doesn't allow any uncertainty or doubt, which in a very grey world will often lead to her being at odds with reality essentially, because while on the other hand, Calca Bizarris is willing to do bad things in order to achieve good outcomes, or at the very least delegate tasteless tasks to Remedios' hot sister. Did I really say the quiet part out loud? Anyhow, Remedios herself will never compromise on her moral code, even if it means that thousands will die and millions will suffer. For example, during the liberation of one of the torture camps, where thousands of the Holy Kingdom citizens had been held captive in order to be skinned alive repeatedly, the entire liberation army had been halted by one of the demi-human leaders. The Bearfolk leader ordered them to back off, or otherwise one of the children taken as hostages would be killed. and since Remedios couldn't be responsible for the death of a child, she stopped the entire attack, providing the demi-human torturers with ample opportunity to barricade themselves and strengthen their defensive position, which would have led to much more death and suffering than the loss of a single life. But in the moral black and white thinking of Remedios, you know what I mean, this wasn't even an option. Luckily for her, Ainz was with the Liberation Army at this time, and he simply used Fireball to deep fry the demi-human holding the kids hostage, as well as the hostages themselves, in order to reinvigorate the attack. And with the ruthless killing of a few hostages, Ainz made it also pretty clear that hostages are ineffective, and therefore the demi-humans stopped taking any more. And the same thing repeated during the liberation of an entire city. No matter how much suffering the continued attack on the demi-human held settlement could have prevented, no matter how many people died during the liberation attempt, as soon as the demi-human leader threatened the life of one child, Remedios, knowing full well that this would lead only to more death and suffering for her people, stopped the attack once more, and ordered a retreat. And I for once think that Remedios serves as a nice illustration of why precisely moral absolutism doesn't work in a morally grey setting. And all of this ties in with the more Machiavellian methods and the ever greater desire for power Ainz pursues, for he does bad things, knowing full well that they are bad, for the greater good of his own people and the long-term peace and prosperity of the realms under him. Destroy one country and educate 1,000, and this worldview impressed Neia enough that she formed her infamous "Weakness is a sin" statement. A link to a video about this down below in the description, because I have made several videos already about this topic. That said, let's take a closer look at why nobody came to the aid of the Holy Kingdom. A human and deeply religious nation nonetheless, that was attacked not only by Yaldabaoth, but also by his demi-human subjects of the Abalion Hills that he just recently had conquered. And the reason for why seemingly nobody came to the help is in actuality two reasons. And the first one is the religious schism between the theocracy and the Holy Kingdom. Again, while the Holy Kingdom is deeply religious, as much as slain in some parts, they don't follow the 6 great gods and worship them like the theocracy does. For the same reason, the Kingdom of Archetypes and the slain theocracy had also a miserable diplomatic relationship with another. And the conflict with the Kingdom, for example, was among other things about whether or not angels are truly divine beings sent by the 6 great gods, or just another type of monster, which the Kingdom of Archetypes and the temples within it preach. And these differences were really important for the theocracy. And therefore I assume that some kind of schism over some kind of definition had similarly occurred between the Holy Kingdom and Slain. So they had not the best of relationships, to say the absolute least, but still, the Holy Kingdom was a human kingdom after all. So while the Holy Kingdom did not ask Slain for help, Slain at least should send a scripture, even undercover, in to aid them in their defense. And normally they likely would have done so. But they not only faced Yaldabaoth, who was way stronger than, let's for example say, the Sunlight Scripture could handle, but also the fact that the Sunlight Scripture had been destroyed by Ainz recently, alongside with losing the ability to use their world-class item, Downfall of Castle and Country, because Shelty had destroyed Cria's life for good. She couldn't even be resurrected afterwards. So, in combination with the still ongoing war against the Elf Kingdom, prevented Slain from aiding the Holy Kingdom more directly. As for Archetypes, the Kingdom Neia's Liberation Army actually had set up camp in for a few months. They simply couldn't muster the strength to aid the beleaguered Holy Kingdom, even though they themselves had been recently attacked by the Demon Emperor Yaldabaoth and chased him off. And the reason for this were twofold. The first is that after being broken on the Cuts plane by the Dark Young of Ainz, they were deeply disturbed and greatly weakened, much of their leadership had actually been killed on the field, and what has been left was, how do I formulate this? It was a bit Philip, to say the absolute least. And before that they had already fought a long drawn-out military conflict with the Empire, prior to this crippling blow. The kingdom therefore could simply not recover its strength, much less spare troops to aid them. As for powerful adventurers within the Kingdom of Archetypes, while Blue Roses had shown their sympathy for the Holy Kingdom and wanted to help them, they made it in a very polite and considerate way clear that they just recently had lost 2 of their members, and even though they had been revived, they still needed a lot more training to recover their former strength. It was also doubtful that even at their full strength, they could be able to match or do anything against such a strong foe as Yaldabaoth, which led to one of Remedios' many inconsiderate and emotional outbursts. As for possible alternative allies, the Holy Kingdom did not approach the Dwarf Kingdom because they likely did not even know that it still existed, nor would they believe that dwarves, in their mountain holes, would send troops to aid a human nation. As for the Arclan Council State, it too was a majority demi-human nation, and a good chunk of the troops that had recently occupied the northern part of the Holy Kingdom were demi-humans themselves. So any aid seemed highly unlikely given these differences and the similarities between the two forces. As for the Empire of Barut, they had the military and the money to spare, but they had been recently subjugated by the Sorcerer Kingdom, which meant that they were not an independent political actor anymore. And the reason for why nobody besides the Sorcerer Kingdom could send in aid is because the Sorcerer King has forced the adventurer Momon, who had beaten Yaldabaoth just recently in the capital city of Archetypes, to become his own personal and very human enforcer, in order to keep the population of Irantel docile. So ultimately, just as Demiurge had planned, the Holy Kingdom had no other choice as to ask the Sorcerer Kingdom for Momon's aid, which meant that the Kingdom of Ainz had now an opportunity to offer something finer, the aid of His Majesty himself. So the Holy Kingdom's conquest was one of the longest and most complicated plots in Overlord, while the dwarves and Quagoa and the frost dragons that ruled over them or tried to exterminate them were taken under Ainz Ulgon's umbrella in a single volume, and while the Empire was misled and then finally outmaneuvered into becoming a vassal state of the Sorcerer Kingdom in just 3 volumes, the conquest of the Holy Kingdom lasted indeed much longer. And it literally all dates back to the Happy Farm and its establishment, for in the 12th novel, we learn from Pavel Baraya, Neia Baraya's father, that he suspected that still some demi-humans from the Abalion Hills are able to cross in and out of the Holy Kingdom's territory and abducting the people there, despite it literally being protected by the equivalent to Hadrian's Wall or simply the wall from Game of Thrones. But what in truth was happening was that Demiurge had abducted people from the Holy Kingdom, the infamous 2-legged sheep, in order to relocate them to his Happy Farm, where they were flayed alive repeatedly thanks to healing magic, in order to turn their skin into scrolls for spells and messages. And it goes much further than that. See, through the various abduction missions, Demiurge and his troops gained valuable experience about the layout of the Holy Kingdom, how the political system works there, where the most important political actors are usually at, and how they relate to each other. And in Volume 11, Ainz Ulgon also noted that Demiurge had worked for a very long time inside and with the Holy Kingdom, hence why our Overlord was so nervous about potentially spoiling all of his hard work. And Demiurge also did far more than just learning about the kingdom's high society, but he had actually abducted and replaced key figures, such as Prince Caspont, the older brother of Calca Besaris, the Holy Queen, who ascended to the throne instead of him, in order to better control both sides of the upcoming war, once the Queen was clubbed to death. And the war itself was, and this is really important to acknowledge, just a pretext for bringing the Holy Kingdom into the sphere of influence of the sorcerer kingdom of Ainz without arousing much suspicion within the neighboring nations. The war itself was never meant to conquer the Holy Kingdom permanently and to establish a demi-human demon state ruled by Yaldabaoth, so it basically went like with the demon incursion into Rhea's ties, where Momon has fought against Yaldabaoth, albeit in a much grander scale and without a natural trait among the ranks of the Holy Kingdom. But in the case of the Holy Kingdom, the role of Renner had then been played by the Doppelkaspont, who again was played all of the time. We see him in the actual novels by a greater doppelganger, while his real body was kept preserved and in pristine condition within the Great Tomb of Nezarec. The conquest of the demi-human tribe of Abalion, which had been done by the demon emperor Yaldabaoth, Demiurge's alter ego, was also something that was done to save the face of the sorcerer kingdom. See the cruelty with which the demon emperor reigned over his subjects, going so far as to exterminate entire tribes whom he found lacking or just unruly, was something that would have stained the record of the sorcerer kingdom and lowered the opinion of quite a few species and states about the sorcerer king himself. But since it had been done by Yaldabaoth, it also helped to drive home what a threat the demon emperor truly is, and that he is indeed a threat to all species. And of course, Ainz could only liberate the demi-humans of Abalion if they were suppressed and occupied in the first place. Demiurge also used his alter ego to conduct large-scale demi-human heteromorph and humanoid crossbreeding experiments, something he worked on for quite some time, and something that he believed will greatly aid Nezarec in the future. And since all of this cruelty would go a long way to paint the demon emperor as truly evil, Ainz would get a lot more credit, especially from within the demi-human society, for his liberation efforts. After all of this was set up, the proper invasion of Yaldabaoth and his subjugated demi-human tribes and his demons finally commenced, and Demiurge again made sure to instruct the demons in order to let some humans escape, so that news of his conquest would spread properly from the capital of Hobrun and to the rest of the world. Again, this was not so much a conquest as it was a way to bring the Holy Kingdom under the protection and influence of the Sorcerer Kingdom, and it was also a way to polish the public perception of the most powerful person inside the Sorcerer Kingdom. And from Ainz' perspective, it was also a great way to shield some runecraft weapons. Afterwards, the invasion army conquered the northern part of the Holy Kingdom, which, by the way, is also a deeply divided nation. The south, for example, favored the ascendance of Caspont Besaris to the throne, and took quite ill to him passing his chance of kingship down to his little sister. And now that the north was ravaged, the south took at least initially a defensive stance, so that the north suffered far greater losses under Yaldabaoth, thus ensuring that the rift and the tension between the two sides opened considerably afterwards. And while the occupation takes its toll on the Northern Holy Kingdom, the Liberation Army, which was just a couple of dozen men strong at this time, asked the Kingdom of Rhea's ties for help, only to be reminded that they had to deal with the aftermath of Splat, and that they need to ask the Sorcerer Kingdom for help, specifically for Momon's aid, who became the Sourceware Kingdom's enforcer. So this once mighty human nation had been humiliated on the international stage of diplomacy, since they had been rendered in a state of impotence. And this was also a very vital part of Demiurge's strategy. The Holy Kingdom in general, and a certain paladin in particular, despises the undead and teaches that they are evil, life-hating creatures, which, in the greater context of the New World, is actually true. Ainz is just the exception to this rule, because he's a human soul in an undead overlord's body. And therefore having a deeply religious leader from a deeply religious anti-undead nation ask the undead king himself for aid had been a major diplomatic and geostrategic victory for the Sourceware King of Ainz Olgorn. And it, together with the subjugation and subsequent boom of the empire, and the friendly relationship that he himself had established with the Dwarven Kingdom, paved the way for much greater international recognition. Afterwards, Ainz informed them that they can't spare Momon at the moment, because he keeps the peace among the human population, since Momon, of course, is a human himself who enjoys human activities like breathing and having blood flow to his body and stuff. So, Ainz Olgorn offered his own personal assistance instead, therefore maximizing the reputational gain he would have in the process. And now Ainz leads the Liberation Army to one victory after another, in order to impress Remedios Custodio, who still despised the Sourceware King because he's undead. So instead, he had shifted his focus towards Neia, who subsequently had been revived and now preaches that Ainz is justice. This, for Demiurge and Ainz, unexpected religious component shifted the hearts and minds of a vast part of the population of the Holy Kingdom, since the faith did nothing to protect them, and since Neia's faith was responsible for liberating them, and for actually defeating demons, while again the angels and the holy spells had all failed to contain Yaldabaoth. So this new religion spread rapidly. And of course, having a northern part that preaches that this undead here is justice, and having a southern part that preaches that all undead are evil and need to be purged, also sharply increased the divide within the nation, and finally the war ended after Yaldabaoth had seemingly destroyed Ainz Olgorn and was currently frying the Southern Holy Kingdom's army. He seemed unstoppable at this time, but then Ainz Olgorn returned after liberating the demi-humans of Abalion, and he came to the aid of the beleaguered Holy Kingdom's armies with his own army of demi-human tribes liberated from the yoke of Yaldabaoth. And then he could defeat the Demon Emperor in front of the most people possible. And of course he saved the day. Afterwards the Sourceware Kingdom sent aid and help in the rebuilding of the nation, thus increasing their own reputation again. Meanwhile, Caspon Bezaris, or rather his Nezaric-controlled doppelganger, made one dumb decision after another, as the new king, in order to provoke and finally trigger a civil war, which, much to my disappointment, happened entirely off-screen. But of course, the North, thanks to the aid of the Sourceware Kingdom and Runecraft, prevailed, and thus had managed to defeat the South, who started this war, and therefore lost all of its reputation and goodwill among an already war-weary and tired population. And with the loss of the South, the religion the South represented also lost, and instead Neia's faith could spread to the Holy Kingdom, and while it still had been a mess and still depended on the aid of the Sourceware Kingdom, now Neia and her allies, Shizodelta, Sebastian and a lot of other Nezaric-aligned men and women, were finally putting the kingdom back together. Now that it had a proper religion and a proper Nezaric-friendly foreign policy. And once the grain shipment had been attacked, they of course supported the military actions against the kingdom of Riestais, along with many other nations, such as the Empire, the Dwarven Nation, and of course the Dragon Kingdom, who now also receive protection from the Sorcerer Kingdom. And that's how the Sorcerer King, or rather Demiurge, had conquered the Holy Kingdom. The Holy Kingdom is actually a misleading name, because it consists of two regions that are barely held together. To explain, the Holy Kingdom is located at the western end of the nameless continent, where Overlord takes place. It borders the sea to the north, west and south, and is connected to the rest of the continent by a narrow land bridge. Its direct border is the Abalion Hills, inhabited by various tribes of demi-humans and heteromorphs who are in constant conflict with one another. And they pose a great threat to the Holy Kingdom, even though the individual tribes and groups are at odds with each other. Nearly perpetually, it is not uncommon for them to attempt to raid into the Holy Kingdom in search of food and perhaps new settlement land, causing significant damage. For this reason, a wall similar to Hadrian's Wall was built along the outer border of the Holy Kingdom. This fortification serves as both a boundary and a warning system to stop raids, or at the very least, to give the interior time to mobilize paladins and elements of the population, since of course there's compulsory military service to intercept and neutralize the threat. Trade is either conducted via a narrow land route that connects the Holy Kingdom to Riestais, or by sea. And the sea route is actually far safer than the land route, thanks to the good relationships with a water dragon, among many other things. And of course, since the sea is inhabited by actually sentient life forms, mermaids and mermen for example, they can also directly trade with the inhabitants of the sea. However, the sea is also a major factor contributing to the internal divide of the Holy Kingdom. The two halves of the Holy Kingdom, separated by a large bay, have developed very different and very unique political power centers, because each peninsula prioritizes its own needs due to the spatial proximity. Essentially, two roughly equally strong regional centers have emerged within one and the same nation, whose economic, political, and social structures are spatially isolated from one another. So for a merchant in the south, traveling to Riestais, another kingdom, is practically the same as traveling to the northern part of their very own kingdom, in terms of feel, in terms of means of transportation, and the only difference is the time it takes for the travel to occur. And the division and the competing interests often manifest in the rivalry between the northern and the southern nobility. This division reached a temporary peak when Queen Calca ascended the throne. The southern nobles originally wanted Prince Caspond as king. As the firstborn, he was the expected next king and crown prince. However, unlike Prince Barbaro from the Riestais kingdom, Caspond had enough self-awareness to recognize that it would be better for him and for the kingdom if he renounces his claim to the throne in favor of his younger sister, Calca. Thus we have a political situation similar to that in the Riestais kingdom, with the difference that here everyone set aside their egos for the good of the country. In the Riestais kingdom, Barbaro fought his smarter half-brother for the succession, leading to political division within the kingdom that is, from a geographic standpoint, very, very internally integrated with itself, and not separated like the Holy Kingdom. And of course, neither of these siblings would have been willing to give up their claim to the throne to allow the other to rule for the good of the country. And of course, the princess in Riestais didn't care about the nation at all. She just pretended to be the good and honest and upstanding queen so that the boy she likes would think more highly of her. And of course, neither of the two siblings would ever consider, and the rest of the royal court for that matter, would ever consider to give the third princess the throne. The southern nobles, back in the Holy Kingdom, were enraged by Prince Caspond's lenience towards his younger sister. Not only was Calca Besaris the first queen in the country's entire history, but her closest confidants, Remedios and Kelart Custodio, were also extremely influential. With the royal crown in Calca Besaris' hands, the high priestess position given to Kelart Custodio, and the paladin order, now led by her older sister, Remedios Custodio, the sovereign nobles were effectively excluded from all powerful positions in favor of a princess, recently turned queen, that no one expected would take the throne, so they of course lacked any meaningful connections to this new power center that now hogged all the places of high power. And as a result, they were also excluded from the inner circle of power, and therefore they tried to place every conceivable obstacle in the way of the queen. They spread rumors about the close relationship between the three women at the top. As you make your bed, so you must lie in it. The question is, with whom? In other words, even though Calca Besaris only wanted the best for her country, she is not as effective in governing because she has too many scruples, and actually wants the best for her people, in sharp contrast to Princess Renner. Additionally, by not involving the sovereign nobility in power, she has fostered bitter resentment from the sovereign nobility. This, combined with the natural geographic division of the entire nation and the isolation of its two regions, means that at the beginning of the Overlord film, the Holy Kingdom is deeply divided and at odds internally, and how this conflict will affect the further course of the war and the resulting problems can be then seen in the Overlord movie, but for today, that it is.